Jake Morrison stood at the wide window of the human ship Aurora Dream and watched the massive space station grow larger before them. Nexus Prime looked like a giant crystal flower floating in the dark of space. Its clear walls sparkled with lights from hundreds of different alien ships docked at its ports. Today would make history. 3 major powers of the galaxy would meet for the first time to talk about peace instead of war. Dr. Casey Mitchell walked up beside Jake and handed him a datapad filled with information about the aliens they would meet. Casey was the ship's expert on alien biology and had spent months studying everything they knew about their new contacts. Her brown hair was pulled back tight, and her face showed the worry she felt about this meeting. Jake looked at the pad but did not really read it. He had always been better at thinking on his feet than memorizing facts from books. The human government had chosen him for this job because he could talk to anyone and make them feel comfortable. He had successfully negotiated trade deals with 12 different human colonies and had never failed to reach an agreement that everyone could live with. Casey pointed to pictures on the datapad, showing the 2 alien species they would meet. The first were called elves by humans because they looked similar to creatures from old Earth stories. They were tall and beautiful with pointed ears and lived for thousands of years. The second species were called the Zarkathi and looked like giant lizards that walked on 2 legs. Both species were much older than humanity and had been fighting each other for centuries, before humans even learned how to build ships that could travel between stars. The ship docked with Nexus Prime with a soft bump that Jake barely felt through the metal floor. Captain Martinez announced over the ship's communication system that they had arrived and that the diplomatic team should prepare to meet their alien counterparts. Jake straightened his best blue suit and checked his appearance in the mirror one more time. His brown hair was neat, and his green eyes showed the confidence that had served him well in past negotiations. Luna Rodriguez joined them at the airlock door. She was the security chief for this mission and would be responsible for keeping everyone safe during the talks. Luna was shorter than Jake, but her muscular build and the way she carried herself made it clear that she could handle any trouble that might come their way. She wore a simple gray uniform that hid the various weapons and protective devices she carried. The airlock opened and they stepped into Nexus Prime for the first time. The main corridor was huge, with the ceiling so high that Jake could barely see the top. The walls were made of some kind of clear material that let them see into the space around the station. Ships of all sizes and shapes moved past like fish swimming in a vast ocean. An alien that looked like a giant insect, with 4 arms and compound eyes, approached their group. This was Ambassador Kyrish, who had organized the peace talks. The insect being spoke in perfect human language through a translation device attached to its throat. Ambassador Kyrish led them through several corridors to a large round room with a crystal table in the center. The room had no chairs because each species had different body shapes and sitting requirements. Instead, there were platforms at different heights around the table where each delegation could stand or arrange themselves as they preferred. Jake was looking around the impressive room when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw the most beautiful woman he had ever encountered walking into the room. She was tall and graceful with silver hair that seemed to glow with its own light. Her ears came to sharp points, and her eyes were the color of deep forest leaves. She wore elegant armor that looked like it was made from moonlight and shadow. This had to be Lirelei Moonwhisper, the elven representative. Lirelei moved with the fluid grace of someone who had trained in combat for many lifetimes. Jake could see that despite her beauty, she was dangerous. Her hand rested near the handle of a sword that hung at her side, and her eyes constantly scanned the room for potential threats. When she looked at Jake, her expression was polite, but distant, as if she was evaluating whether he was worth her time and attention. The room fell silent when the 3rd delegation entered. Commander Zixthera of the Zarkathi warrior clans was impressive and intimidating. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, with dark green scales covering her muscular body. Her head was shaped like that of a large lizard with yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the crystal room's lighting. But what caught Jake's attention most was her tail. The tail was thick and powerful, looking like it could knock down a tree with a single swing. It was covered in the same dark green scales as the rest of her body, but had bright blue patterns that seemed to pulse and shift like living lightning. The tail moved constantly behind her in slow hypnotic waves that Jake found fascinating to watch. Commander Zixthera wore simple armor that looked practical rather than decorative. Various weapons hung from her belt, and Jake could see old battle scars on her arms and face. She was clearly a warrior who had seen many fights and survived them all. When she looked at the human delegation, her expression was curious but cautious. Ambassador Kyrish began the formal introductions following ancient diplomatic protocols that were supposed to show respect to all parties involved. Jake stepped forward when it was his turn and gave a slight bow to both alien representatives. He had practiced this movement many times on the ship, but it still felt awkward compared to his usual casual style. The formal part of the introduction went smoothly until Jake decided to add his own personal touch to break the ice. He had always found that a little humor and charm could make negotiations go more easily. He looked at Commander Zixthera and smiled his most winning smile. Jake gestured toward the commander's tail and spoke in what he thought was a friendly and complimentary tone. He told her that her tail was the most beautiful and graceful thing he had ever seen, and that the patterns on it reminded him of lightning dancing across a summer sky. He thought he was being charming and diplomatic. The effect of his words was immediate and terrible. Commander Zixthera went completely still, and her yellow eyes widened in what Jake realized was shock and anger. The blue patterns on her tail began to pulse faster and brighter. Lirelei took a quick step backward, and her hand moved to her sword handle. Ambassador Kyrish made a sound that Jake thought might be the insect equivalent of a gasp. Jake realized he had made a serious mistake, but he did not understand what he had done wrong. He tried to apologize, but Commander Zixthera raised one clawed hand to stop him from speaking. The patterns on her tail were now pulsing so fast that they looked like a solid blue glow. The tail began to swell, and Jake could hear a high-pitched humming sound coming from it. Lirelei shouted a warning in her own language and began to weave her hands in complex patterns. A barrier of silver light appeared around Jake just as Commander Zixthera lost control of her tail's defensive mechanism. The tail exploded with the force of a bomb. The explosion threw everyone in the room in different directions like leaves caught in a hurricane. Jake felt himself lifted off his feet and slammed against the crystal wall behind him. The silver barrier that Lirelei had created around him flickered and sparked as it absorbed most of the blast, but he still felt like he had been hit by a moving vehicle. Chunks of the crystal table scattered across the floor like deadly rain. The beautiful round room now looked like a war zone with scorch marks on the walls and debris everywhere. Emergency lights began flashing red, and an alarm system started, making loud warning sounds throughout the station. Jake tried to stand up, but his legs felt weak and his head was spinning. He could taste blood in his mouth, and his ears were ringing from the explosion. When his vision cleared, he saw Lirelei crouched nearby, with her hands pressed against a deep cut on her forehead. Silver blood ran between her fingers, but her green eyes were alert and focused on him. Commander Zixthera stood in the center of the destroyed room, looking horrified at what had happened. Where her magnificent tail had been, there was now only a bleeding stump that she was trying to cover with her hands. Jake could see that she was in terrible pain, but she was also clearly ashamed and embarrassed by what her body had done. Luna Rodriguez came running into the room with her security team right behind her. She had her weapon drawn and was ready for a fight, but stopped when she saw that the explosion had come from one of the delegates rather than from an attack by enemies. She quickly began organizing her people to secure the area and help the wounded. Dr. Casey Mitchell arrived with her medical equipment and immediately went to work treating the injured. She was calm and professional, even though Jake could see that. She was worried about the diplomatic disaster that had just occurred. She cleaned the cut on Liralei's forehead while explaining to Jake what had happened. Casey told him that Zarkathi tails were not just decorative but were actually living weapons that could explode when the warrior felt threatened or challenged in specific ways. The tail would regrow over time, but the process was extremely painful and left the warrior vulnerable until the new tail was fully developed. What Jake had thought was innocent flirting had been interpreted as a direct challenge to Commander Zixthara's authority and status. Jake felt sick to his stomach when he realized how badly he had misunderstood the situation. He had come here to make peace between the three species, but instead had created an incident that might start a war. He watched as Ambassador Kyrish spoke rapidly in several different languages, trying to explain to other station officials what had happened. Commander Zixthara was speaking to her own people in harsh growling sounds that Jake assumed was the Zarkathi language. He could not understand the words, but the tone made it clear that she was angry and frustrated. Some of the other Zarkathi warriors looked like they wanted to attack the human delegation in revenge for their commanders. Humiliation. Liralee finished letting Casey treat her wound and walked over to where Jake was sitting on the floor. Despite being hurt in the explosion, she moved with the same fluid grace he had noticed when she first entered the room. When she knelt down beside him, her expression was serious, but not unkind. She explained to Jake that Commander Zixthara had not meant to explode her tail, and was probably more upset about the incident than anyone else in the room. The Zarkathi were a proud warrior culture, and losing control of their defensive mechanisms was considered a sign of weakness. The commander would be facing shame and ridicule from her own people because of what had happened. Jake asked if there was any way to fix the situation and make things right with the Zarkathi delegation. He was willing to do whatever it took to repair the damage his mistake had caused. Liralee was quiet for a long moment as she considered his question. Her ancient eyes seemed to be weighing his character and deciding whether he was worth helping. Finally, she told him that there might be a way to salvage the peace negotiations, but it would be dangerous and there was no guarantee of success. The Zarkathi had a ritual called the Trial of Sincere Intent that was used when someone was accused of giving insult or making threats they claimed were unintentional. The accused person had to face the offended warrior in single combat to prove that their words came from ignorance rather than malice. Jake felt his heart sink when he heard this. He was not a fighter and had never been in a real battle in his life. Commander Zixthara was a trained warrior who had probably killed more enemies than Jake had ever met people. Fighting her seemed like suicide, but he could not think of any other way to fix what he had broken. Luna Rodriguez overheard their conversation and immediately objected to the idea of Jake fighting an alien warrior. As security chief, it was her job to protect him, and she was not going to let him get himself killed because of a cultural misunderstanding. She suggested that they should just call off the negotiations and try again later, when tensions had cooled down. But Ambassador Kyrish spoke up and said that this might be their only chance for peace. The three species had been fighting each other for so long that many people on all sides wanted the wars to continue. If these negotiations failed, it might be years or decades before another opportunity arose. In that time, millions more beings would die in battles across the galaxy. Dr. Casey was checking her portable computer and frowning at what she was reading. She had been studying Zarkathi biology and physiology for months, preparing for this meeting. She told them that the tail regeneration process was incredibly painful, and that Commander Zixthara would be suffering greatly for weeks as her new tail grew back. The commander was hiding her pain to maintain her dignity, but Casey could see signs of the agony she was enduring. Jake made his decision. He told the group that he would accept the trial of sincere intent and face Commander Zixthara in combat. It was his mistake that had caused this problem, and it was his responsibility to fix it. He asked Liralee if she would teach him anything that might help him survive the trial. Liralee looked at him with what might have been respect growing in her ancient eyes. She had seen many humans during her long life, and most of them were selfish and cowardly when faced with real danger. Jake was willing to risk his life to repair the damage his ignorance had caused, and that showed a kind of courage that even elves could admire. She agreed to help him prepare for the trial, but warned him that she could not teach him to fight well enough to defeat a Zarkathi warrior in just a few days. Instead, she would try to teach him how to survive long enough to prove that his intentions had been innocent. The trial lasted for 3 minutes, and if he could avoid being killed for that long, then his sincerity would be accepted. Commander Zixthera approached their group slowly and carefully. Jake could see that every step caused her pain because of her missing tail, but she was trying not to show her weakness. When she spoke, her voice was deep and rough, but the translation device made her words clear. She told Jake that she accepted his request for the trial of sincere intent. The combat would take place in 2 days, to give him time to prepare, and to allow the proper witnesses to gather. She warned him that she would not hold back during the fight, because showing mercy would dishonor both of them. If he survived the trial, she would know that his words had come from ignorance rather than malice, and the peace negotiations could continue. Jake thanked her for giving him the chance to prove himself, and apologized again for his cultural mistake. Commander Zixthera nodded once, and then turned to leave with her delegation. Jake watched her go, and wondered if he had just agreed to commit suicide in the name of diplomacy. Jake spent the next morning in his quarters trying to prepare mentally for what might be his last day alive. He had sent messages to his family back on Earth explaining what had happened and why he felt he had to go through with the trial. He did not want them to think he had died for nothing if the worst happened. Lirelei arrived at his door just after lunch, carrying a bag of equipment. She had changed out of her formal diplomatic armor, and now wore simple training clothes that allowed her to move more freely. Even in plain clothing, she moved with the deadly grace that marked her as a warrior who had survived countless battles. She led him to an empty cargo bay that Luna had cleared for their training sessions. The large room gave them plenty of space to practice and was far enough from other areas of the ship that they would not disturb anyone. Lirelei set down her bag and began pulling out various pieces of training equipment. Jake had expected her to start teaching him fighting moves and combat techniques, but instead, she made him sit on the floor and close his eyes. She told him that the most important thing for surviving the trial was not learning how to fight, but learning how to endure pain and fear without panic or anger. She explained that Zarkathi combat was not just about physical strength, but also about showing proper respect and honor to your opponent. If Jake tried to fight Commander Zixthera as an equal, he would be showing disrespect, because he was clearly not her equal in combat skill. Instead, he needed to show that he understood her superiority, while demonstrating his own courage and sincerity. The training was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Lirelei taught him breathing techniques that elves had used for thousands of years to control fear and pain. She showed him how to move his body in ways that would minimize damage while still showing respect to his opponent. Most importantly, she taught him how to fall and roll so that attacks that should have broken his bones would instead just bruise him badly. During breaks in the training, Lirelei told him stories of her long life and the many different species she had encountered. She had been alive for over 2,000 years, and had seen the rise and fall of civilizations that humans had never heard of. She admitted that she had never met a human willing to risk everything for the sake of peace with beings he had just met. Jake asked her why she was helping him, when her own people had nothing to gain from the peace negotiations. The elves were powerful enough to defend themselves and did not really need allies against the Zarkathi, or anyone else. Lirelei was quiet for a long moment before answering his question. She told him that her people had been watching humanity for many years as they spread across the galaxy. Most elves thought humans were too young and reckless to be trusted with the power they were gaining. But some elves believed that humanity's willingness to adapt and learn from mistakes might make them valuable allies in the future. This trial would help her decide which group was right. Meanwhile, Dr. Casey was working with Ambassador Kyrish in the station's medical facility. They were studying everything they could find about Zarkothi biology and looking for ways to help Commander Zixthera deal with the pain of her regenerating tail. Casey had brought advanced human medical technology that might be able to ease the commander's suffering. Casey discovered that the tail regeneration process was even more painful than she had originally thought. The new tail had to regrow, not just muscle and bone, but also the complex bioelectrical systems that allowed it to store and release explosive energy. Commander Zixthera was essentially growing a living weapon inside her own body, and the process was causing constant agony. Ambassador Kyrish helped Casey understand more about Zarkothi culture and why the commander was hiding her pain. Showing weakness was considered shameful for a warrior and could result in loss of rank and status. Commander Zixthera would rather suffer in silence than admit that she needed help dealing with her injury. Casey designed a small device that could be attached to the base of the regenerating tail to help control the pain without interfering with the natural healing process. The device used human medical technology combined with information about Zarkothi nervous systems that Ambassador Kyrish had provided. It would not completely eliminate the pain, but would make it manageable. The problem was getting Commander Zixthera to accept help from the humans who had caused her injury in the first place. Casey knew that offering medical assistance could be seen as another insult if it was not presented in the right way. She asked Ambassador Kyrish to help her understand how to approach the commander without causing more offense. Luna Rodriguez was dealing with a different kind of problem. Her security scans of the station had detected several suspicious individuals who did not seem to belong to any of the official delegations. These people were trying hard to avoid being noticed and had various weapons and communication devices that suggested they were not ordinary civilians. Luna suspected that enemies of the peace process had sent agents to sabotage the negotiations. There were extremist groups in all three species who wanted the wars to continue because they profited from the conflict, or believed that their people were superior to all others. These groups would do anything to prevent a peace treaty from being signed. She began tracking the suspicious individuals while trying not to alert them to her surveillance. She needed to figure out what they were planning and stop them before they could disrupt the trial or hurt any of the delegates. The problem was that she had to be careful not to create another diplomatic incident by arresting people who might be innocent. Back in the cargo bay, Jake was learning just how difficult it was going to be to survive 3 minutes against a trained Zarkothi warrior. Even with Lirali's teaching, he was still getting knocked down and bruised in every practice session. His human body was simply not built for the kind of punishment he would face in the trial. Lirale could see that he was becoming discouraged, and sat down beside him during one of their breaks. She told him that courage was not about being unafraid but about doing what was right, despite being afraid. She had seen many warriors who were physically stronger than Jake, but lacked his determination to make things right. She also told him about a gift that Casey had asked her to give to Commander Zixthera. The pain relief device might be seen as a gesture of good faith if it was presented properly during the trial. It would show that humans cared about the suffering they had caused and wanted to help heal the damage they had done. Jake realized that this might be more important than anything he could do in combat. If he could show Commander Zixthera that his mistake had come from ignorance rather than malice, then maybe she would be willing to forgive him and continue with the peace negotiations. The trial was not just about surviving physical combat, but about proving the sincerity of his regret. On the evening before the trial, Jake sat in his quarters, writing in his personal journal. He wrote about everything he had learned over the past 2 days, and about the people who had helped him prepare for what might be his last day alive. He realized that even if he died in the trial, he had learned more about courage and friendship than he had ever known before. Lirale came to see him one last time before the trial. She brought him a simple white shirt and pants to wear during the combat. She explained that white was the color of sincerity in Zarkothi culture, and would help show that his intentions were pure. She also gave him a small blessing in the ancient Elven language that she said would give him strength when he needed it most. Jake thanked her for everything she had done to help him. He told her that regardless of what happened in the trial, he was grateful to have met someone as wise and kind as she was. Lirelei smiled and told him that she would be watching the trial and would be proud of him no matter what the outcome. As Jake tried to sleep that night, he thought about all the people who were counting on him to succeed. If he failed the trial, the peace negotiations would end, and the three species would continue fighting each other for years to come. Millions of beings would die in battles that could have been prevented if he had just been more careful with his words. But he also thought about the friends he had made and the things he had learned. Even if he died tomorrow, he would die knowing that there were good people in all three species who wanted peace more than war. That knowledge would have to be enough to give him the courage to face whatever Commander Zixtera had planned for him. The combat arena on Nexus Prime was a circular room with high walls and a floor made of some kind of metal that could absorb impacts and energy blasts. Representatives from all three species gathered in observation platforms around the arena to witness the trial of sincere intent. The air felt heavy with tension as everyone waited to see if the peace negotiations could be saved. Jake entered the arena, wearing the white clothes that Lirelei had given him. In his hand, he carried the small pain relief device that Dr. Casey had designed for Commander Zixtera. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears, but he tried to walk with confidence and dignity. Commander Zixtera entered from the opposite side of the arena. She had replaced her damaged armor with traditional Zarkathi combat gear that left her arms and legs free for fighting. The stump where her tail had been was covered with a metal cap to protect the regenerating tissue underneath. Jake could see that every movement caused her pain, but she showed no weakness in front of the watching crowd. Ambassador Kyrish stepped into the center of the arena to explain the rules of the trial. Jake had to survive for 3 minutes, while Commander Zixtera tested his sincerity through combat. He was not allowed to use any weapons, but he could try to defend himself in any way he chose. If he lasted the full 3 minutes without fleeing or begging for mercy, then his claim of innocent intent would be accepted. The commander approached Jake before the trial began, and he offered her the pain relief device that Casey had designed. He explained in simple words that humans wanted to help heal the damage they had caused, and hoped she would accept this gift as a sign of their sincere regret. Commander Zixtera examined the device carefully before attaching it to the metal cap covering her tail stump. Jake saw her eyes widen slightly as the device began to work, and the constant pain she had been enduring started to fade. For the first time since the explosion, she stood completely upright, and her movements became more fluid. She nodded once to Jake in what he hoped was acknowledgement of his gesture. Ambassador Kyrish raised one of his 4 arms to signal the start of the trial. Commander Zixtera immediately charged forward with speed that Jake had not expected. Even without her tail for balance, she moved like a trained fighter who had been in countless battles. Jake barely managed to dodge her first attack and felt claws rake across his shoulder as he rolled away. The next few minutes were a blur of movement and pain, as Jake tried to stay alive while showing proper respect to his opponent. He used everything that Lirelei had taught him about rolling and dodging, but Commander Zixtera was simply too fast and too skilled. She could have killed him easily, but instead, she seemed to be testing his reactions and measuring his character. Jake took hit after hit, but kept getting back up and facing her again. His white shirt was torn and stained with blood, but he refused to give up or ask for mercy. Each time she knocked him down, he would stand up and bow slightly to show that he acknowledged her superior skill before preparing to defend himself again. Halfway through the trial, Jake realized that Commander Zixtera was not just testing his physical courage, but also his ability to learn from his mistakes. She kept using the same attacks, and Jake slowly began to recognize the patterns and defend himself more effectively. She seemed pleased when he started to anticipate her moves and avoid some of her strikes. With 1 minute left in the trial, disaster struck. Explosions rocked the station as hidden enemies launched their attack on the peace negotiations. The lights in the arena flickered, and emergency alarms began blaring throughout Nexus Prime. Luna Rodriguez's voice came over the communication system warning that hostile forces were trying to break into the diplomatic sections. Instead of stopping the trial, the attacks seemed to energize Commander Zixtera. She grabbed Jake by the arm and pulled him toward the exit from the arena. Her warrior instincts had taken over, and she was ready to fight the real enemies who threatened the peace process. Jake realized that the trial had become secondary to defending against the saboteurs. They ran through corridors filled with smoke and debris as the unknown attackers tried to reach the diplomatic quarters. Jake could hear weapons, fire, and explosions coming from multiple directions. The enemies had planned their attack well and seemed to know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage to the station. Luna and her security team were fighting a running battle with attackers who wore masks to hide their identities. The enemies had weapons and equipment from all three species, which suggested that extremists from each side were working together to sabotage the peace talks. They wanted to create so much chaos and violence that none of the species would trust each other enough to continue negotiating. Jake and Commander Zixtera reached the diplomatic section just as a group of attackers was trying to break down the door to the room where Ambassador Kyrish and the other negotiators were hiding. The attackers had not expected to face a Zarkothi warrior and hesitated when they saw Commander Zixtera approaching them. That hesitation cost them their advantage. Commander Zixtera moved with deadly efficiency, even without her tail to help her balance. She disarmed two attackers before they could react and sent a third flying across the corridor with a powerful kick. Jake tried to help but mostly just tried to stay out of her way as she dealt with the immediate threat. More attackers appeared from a side corridor and Jake found himself between them and Commander Zixtera. One of the enemies raised a weapon, aimed at the commander's back while she was fighting two others. Without thinking, Jake threw himself forward to shield her from the attack and felt burning pain as an energy blast caught him in the side. The blast knocked Jake to the floor, but his action had given Commander Zixtera time to turn and face the new threat. She roared with anger at seeing him wounded while trying to protect her, and unleashed a level of violence that Jake had not seen before. The remaining attackers fled rather than face her rage. Lirelei arrived with reinforcements just as the last of the attackers in their section were being defeated. She had been fighting her own battle against enemies trying to sabotage the station's power systems. Her elegant armor was scorched, and she had cuts on her face, but her eyes blazed with the fire of an ancient warrior who had been pushed to bar. Dr. Casey came running with her medical equipment to treat Jake's wounds. The energy blast had burned a deep groove across his ribs but had not hit any vital organs. As she worked to stop the bleeding, she told him that his quick action had probably saved Commander Zixtera's life, because the weapon that hit him had been aimed at her head. Commander Zixtera knelt beside Jake as Casey worked on his injuries. Her yellow eyes showed an emotion that Jake had not seen before. She told him that his willingness to take an attack meant for her had proven his character more clearly than any trial could have done. A warrior who would risk his life to protect a former enemy was someone who could be trusted completely. Luna Rodriguez reported that the attacks had been stopped and the saboteurs had been captured or driven away. The evidence they found showed that extremist groups from all three species had worked together to prevent the peace negotiations from succeeding. The attack had actually proven that cooperation between the species was not only possible, but necessary to deal with common threats. Ambassador Kyrish announced that the trial of sincere intent was complete, even though the full 3 minutes had not passed. Jake had proven his courage and sincerity, not just by enduring the combat, but by risking his life to protect others when real danger appeared. Commander Zixtera formally accepted his apology for the cultural misunderstanding and agreed to continue with the peace negotiations. As Jake was helped to his feet, he realized that the trial had accomplished something more important than just clearing up his mistake. The shared battle against the saboteurs had shown all three species that they could work together when they faced a common enemy. The real enemies were not each other, but the extremists who wanted to keep the wars going forever. The peace talks could now continue with all three sides, knowing that they had allies they could trust when trouble came. Jake looked around at the damaged corridor and the friends who had fought beside him, and realized that sometimes the best way to make peace was to stand together against those who wanted war. 3 days after the failed attack on Nexus Prime, the three diplomatic teams gathered again in a new conference room. The original meeting chamber was still being repaired from Commander Zixtara's tail explosion, but the new room was just as impressive, with walls that showed views of the stars and planets beyond the station. Jake sat at the negotiating table with bandages still covering the energy burn on his side. The injury hurt when he moved, but he was determined to see the peace process through to the end. Dr. Casey had cleared him for light duty, and Lirale had helped him practice sitting and standing without showing pain during important moments. Commander Zixtara took her place across from him, with a small smile on her reptilian features. The pain relief device that Casey had designed was still helping her deal with the discomfort of her regenerating tail. More importantly, the shared battle against the saboteurs had created a bond of trust between them that no amount of formal diplomacy could have achieved. Ambassador Kyrish called the session to order and began reviewing the peace treaty that the three species had been working on for months. The document was complex and covered everything from trade agreements to mutual defense pacts. But Jake realized that the most important parts of the treaty were not written in the legal language, but were based on the relationships they had built with each other. Lirale had become more than just the elven representative during their time on the station. Her ancient wisdom and combat skills had proven invaluable during the crisis, and she had shown that elves could be trusted partners rather than distant observers. Jake found himself thinking of her as a friend and advisor rather than just a diplomatic contact. The negotiations proceeded smoothly, now that all three sides had seen each other in action during the attack. They had learned that humans could be brave and selfless when others were in danger. They had seen that elves were willing to fight alongside allies when the cause was just. And they had discovered that Sarkathi warriors valued honor and protection of innocence above personal glory. Commander Zixtara surprised everyone by proposing that the three species should establish joint training programs for their military forces. She had been impressed by human adaptability and elven tactical skills during the battle against the saboteurs. She believed that warriors who trained together would be better able to work together when facing common enemies. Luna Rodriguez had prepared a detailed report on the attack that showed how extremists from all three species had cooperated to try to destroy the peace process. The evidence proved that the real threat came not from each other but from those who profited from endless war. This revelation helped convince even the most suspicious delegates that cooperation was necessary for everyone's security. Dr. Casey presented her findings about how human medical technology could help Sarkathi warriors deal with tail injuries and other combat wounds. She had also discovered ways that elven healing techniques could be combined with human medicine to create treatments that were more effective than either approach alone. Medical cooperation could save lives and reduce suffering for all three species. The treaty signing ceremony took place in the main hall of Nexus Prime, with representatives from dozens of other species watching the historic event. Jake wore his best diplomatic uniform despite the bandages underneath and tried to look dignified as he signed the document that would end centuries of warfare. Commander Zixtara had chosen to attend the ceremony even though her tail was still regenerating and she was in constant discomfort. She signed her name with a steady hand and then surprised everyone by making a short speech about the importance of understanding between different cultures. She admitted that her own reaction to Jake's innocent comment had nearly destroyed the chance for peace. Lirale spoke last, and her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through many wars and seen too much death and destruction. She said that the young humans had reminded her That courage was not about being the strongest or the oldest, but about being willing to admit mistakes and risk everything to make things right. After the ceremony, Jake found himself in the station's main garden area, talking with his new friends about their plans for the future. The peace treaty was just the beginning of what they hoped would be a long partnership between their three species. There was still much work to do to build the trust and cooperation that lasting peace required. Commander Zixtera told them that she had been appointed to lead the joint military training program that would bring warriors from all three species together. She was looking forward to learning human flexibility and elven precision, while teaching both species about Zarkothi's strength and endurance. She joked that she would make sure to warn everyone about the proper way to complement a Zarkothi warrior's tale. Lirale had volunteered to serve as a cultural advisor to help the three species understand each other better and avoid the kind of misunderstandings that had nearly ruined the peace talks. Her long life and experience with many different cultures made her uniquely qualified to help bridge the gaps between species that had been enemies for so long. Dr. Casey was excited about the opportunities for medical cooperation that the treaty would create. She had already been invited to visit the Zarkothi homeworld to study their unique biology and healing methods. She was also planning to work with elven healers to understand how their mental techniques could be combined with human technology. Luna Rodriguez would be staying on Nexus Prime as the head of security for the new interspecies cooperation council that would oversee the implementation of the peace treaty. Her experience fighting beside both elves and Zarkothi during the saboteur attack had convinced her that the three species could work together effectively when they faced common challenges. Jake had been offered the position of first human ambassador to both the elven and Zarkothi governments. It would be a challenging job that would require him to spend time on alien worlds learning about cultures that were very different from his own. But after everything that had happened, he could not imagine doing anything else with his life. As they sat in the garden, talking about the future, Jake realized how much he had learned during his short time on Nexus Prime. He had discovered that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with understanding and forgiveness. He had learned that friendship could develop between the most unlikely people when they faced danger together. Most importantly, he had learned that his mistake with Commander Zixtara's tale had not been a complete disaster, but had actually led to something better than anyone had expected. The explosion that had nearly ended the peace talks had instead created opportunities for the three species to see each other's true character and build relationships based on mutual respect. Commander Zixtera approached their group with a message that had just arrived from her home world. Her sister had been appointed as the new fleet commander for the Zarkothi Space Forces, and would be coming to Nexus Prime to meet the human and elven representatives. The commander smiled as she told Jake that her sister had two tails instead of one and was known for being even more explosive than she was. Jake laughed and promised that he would be much more careful about how he complemented alien anatomy in the future, but he was not really worried about meeting Commander Zixtera's sister. He had learned that with patience and understanding, even the most dangerous cultural differences could be overcome. The key was being willing to admit mistakes and work together to find solutions that everyone could live with. The peace treaty between humans, elves, and Zarkothi was just the first step toward a larger goal of bringing all the intelligent species of the galaxy together in cooperation rather than conflict. There would be more challenges and more opportunities for misunderstandings, but Jake was confident that they could be overcome. As the sun set through the transparent walls of the space station, Jake looked out at the ships from three different species docked peacefully side by side. It was a sight that would have been impossible just a week ago, but was now the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history. Sometimes the best things came from the worst mistakes, and the most beautiful friendships grew from the most explosive beginnings.